Well, I think all sensible people have the British Constitution as one of their hobbies. It is the most interesting matter to discuss and be informed about. As Dicey said, Dicey argued, it is Parliament that is the defender of the liberties of the people, of our ancient constitution and of our freedoms. I give way. Hello, and welcome to a perhaps slightly unusual episode of the Why Parliament Works podcast. It's unusual because whilst I've spent a lot of time delving into the back rooms, the cellars, the basements of the legislative process and how Parliament and government interact, I've mostly done so with those who are front of house, with backbenchers, ministers, peers, and so on. Today, however, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk, to discuss what goes on behind the scenes with Talitha Rowland, who is a civil servant, a very important civil servant, who plays a vital role in coordinating the government's legislative plans from the centre of government within the Cabinet Office. Talitha, I've spent an awful lot of time being briefed by you about the various headaches. You are the aspirin, really, of government, I think, is to get rid of the headaches of preparing government legislation. So it's a great pleasure to have this chance to discuss our time working together. And perhaps you could fill in the listeners, indeed the viewers, on what your role requires, what it involves, and how you coordinate everything.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you very much for having me. So the PBL team is part of the Cabinet Secretariat, so it sits at the heart of the Cabinet Office. And really we do two things. We develop the government's legislative programme, so we look across the manifesto commitments that require legislation, and we also work with departments on their sort of legislative needs and priorities as things come up. And from all those, that huge list of requirements and commitments, we try and work out a sensible way of delivering those through Parliament to deliver the maximum number of commitments in the way that works the best and makes the most sense both for government but also for Parliament. And then the second part of our job is, once that programme is established, helping departments to develop their bills, and that's developing them to time. It's making sure that the sort of policy is agreed across Whitehall, that all the different departmental interests are sort of taken account of and brokered where there are differences. And it's also about making sure that bills are ready in the right shape for Parliament, so that parliamentary handling considerations have been taken into account, including things that parliamentary select committees we know will have views on, so making sure that departments understand what challenges and issues are likely to be raised when the bill enters Parliament, and that as far as possible we have managed to preempt them. So that's what we do on the primary side, and then we also have a part of the team that looks after secondary legislation, so triages all the hundreds of SIs that come through government and tries to put those into a good order so that Parliament gets a sort of steady flow of instruments that are landed in to the right time so that they can get approval in the right way.
I wonder if you could talk us through how the cycle works and how do you try and keep it to time?
That is one of the big challenges of the job. So you're right, one of the things I have learnt most starkly in this job is just how long good legislation takes to prepare and the lead-in times for that. And as you say, it's usually at least a year, often longer. So the process really starts with, as you've just said, usually a cross-Whitehall bidding round. So you obviously write out to Secretaries of State inviting their ideas. What we will try and do at that time is give them a sense of where the political priorities are from those manifesto commitments, just to help guide them in that. But it's not just a top-down process, it's also a bottom-up. We encourage departments to look at what legislation they might need, but also new and creative ideas. When we get those bids back in, and they're often very, very numerous, we had well over 100 the first year I did this, the team go through and analyse them all and look at sort of whether measures could be combined, how they might be packaged into a bill, whether they're sensible, their sort of levels of controversy, whether you need legislation at all. Quite often you don't, whether there are any alternative ways of delivering it. And how things might land in Parliament. And from all of that, essentially a big sort of whiteboard exercise. You sort of move different post-its around and to play around with different ideas, and we will then put forward a package of proposals for the priority measures, which we will put both to you and the other business managers and number 10 for agreement. And that's how a kind of rough sketch of the first Queen's speech emerges.
And so you're trying to boil down about 100 initial requests to, say, 25 workable bills. Do you see a lot of old chestnuts come around again and again that people have just kept up their sleeve hoping that one day somebody will pick them up?
Unfortunately so, yes. I fear they never really get taken up, so those departments are bound to be disappointed. But yes, I think there is certainly sort of historically there has been a sort of dusty shelf in some departments where old legislative ideas are sort of dusted down each year and represented to PBL, but perhaps it's not much surprise that those don't tend to find
so
much
the bids
favour.
come in from the departments, they hopefully meet the political priorities, the manifesto commitments. What then happens? What happens to this bill? You've got this great idea, you're going to transform the world, and then how do you make that into a law?
So the first thing is departments knowing what their policy is. So there's quite a big leap from a sort of high-level idea about what you want to achieve to actually working through the policy detail and then working through what that looks like in legislation. And that is what actually takes the majority of the time, and trying to cut that bit of the process short never really works further down the line. So we would typically then work with departments on their delivery plans, which looks like, actually, do you have to do a stakeholder consultation? What are the different strands of work? How do they all align? At what point might you be ready to send instructions to Parliamentary Council so that they can start actually drafting the bill, and putting all of those different strands together in a way that you're always sort of working back from when you think the Queen's speech is. And often that is really, really challenging because they are, in the nature of kind of manifesto commitments, they are big policies that really transform an area of life. So that is a long and complicated process, and it's quite an iterative process, particularly where there are sort of big consultations that need to take place with perhaps sort of businesses or devolved administrations or things like that. So there's a lot of different moving parts that need to be brought together.
And policy has to be agreed between the department, Downing Street, and the Cabinet collectively in a right-round process, but I don't imagine most people have any idea what the right-round process is.
So the right-round process is a way by which collective agreement is sought for the majority of government issues, and it's essentially one Secretary of State writing round to other Cabinet colleagues, setting out their proposals for agreement. And Cabinet colleagues can either endorse that or they can write back with conditions that they'd like to see met. And that's really where we come in, brokering those conditions between departments so that we end up with a policy that all members of Cabinet are content with. But the right round process is really the end of it. We will work with a department throughout the process to sort of identify where other departments might have concerns or interests and make sure they're brought in at the right time.
And so the bill's been agreed, the policy's been agreed, then it goes off to OPC, and this is often the bit that gets squeezed, isn't it, because the policy's late, and OPC is amazing at turning things around quite quickly.
OPC are, some of the most formidable civil servants in government, I have to say. They are phenomenally clever, but also, as you say, managed to turn around some incredibly complex programmes of work to really impressive times. But yes, it's very much our aim in all of this to make sure that there is enough time for the drafting process, because it is really complex, and the law needs to be right, so we need to make sure we leave enough time for it.
And for those of you who are wondering, I failed to say that APC is the Office of Parliamentary Counsel led by First Parliamentary Counsel, who was a subject of one of these podcasts earlier. But they have to be so on the ball, because I remember in the reform of the House of Lords Bill, that I think was 2011, the drafters had remembered to repeal the 1537 Places in Parliament Act, which sets out where people sit in the House of Lords, which, because the Act didn't pass, the bill didn't get through, is still on the statute book. And they have to know every little bit of legislation that needs adjusting and dealing with.
They are amazing. They are some of the most formidable brains in Whitehall, I think.
In your role, you are looking in all sorts of directions, aren't you? Because you're helping departments, but you're also slightly policing departments. you've got to tell people who are quite senior to get their act together and get a move on. How have you found that, and how have people responded when you've been saying to people senior in the civil service and senior politicians that their department's letting the side down and they really need to work a bit harder?
So that is one of the challenges of the job. It's one of the difficult parts, but it's also one of the rewarding parts, because so much of Whitehall obviously works really sort of focused on its own sort of departmental interests, but having to communicate that collective good and collective agenda for the government is it's what I spend about some 90% of my time doing. I think it is really just it is emphasising the knock-on consequences of things. So departments are often naturally very focused on their own legislation, but actually there is a wider government, there is a wider cabinet agenda, and actually explaining, your bill being, a month late has this consequence for Parliament. This is how it will look in Parliament with, not only legislation here. These are the other commitments that it will knock off course, and really trying to get that sense of the kind of whole and the collective responsibility for that.
Because you can't reuse a parliamentary day. So if the bill isn't ready, the parliamentary day is wasted, and you can never get that back in a session. And if you don't get it early enough in the Commons, then the Lords has run out of time by the end of the session and the bill falls. Exactly,
and then collectively over the course of the Parliament you maybe will have lost time for 2-3 bills. So it really does matter. The core part of my job is to make sure that the business managers can use parliamentary time effectively, and that they are not wasting any days, that they can respect minimum intervals between bills, but actually don't really have to wait any longer for an issue to be sorted out, and or don't have to wait for a bill to be introduced. So ensuring that the business managers have maximum flex in scheduling is what we're there to hopefully try and deliver.
So one of the issues you face is handling and making sure that each house is taken care of. And the House of Lords is particularly concerned about delegated powers, which are often created by rushed bill creation. How do you try and square that off to make sure that bills are well written, that's good legislation?
So I think often government and Parliament's interests are more aligned than it might first appear, and it's really trying to bridge that divide and communicate that. So first of all, giving enough time for policy development is the classic way in which that's solved, as we talked about earlier. But explaining to departments that what is going to happen to a bill if they put it in with a huge power, and that they can't sort of articulate how they will use it, and that actually this is going to result in delays to their bill, it's going to result in a load of amendments, it's going to result in sort of Parliament trying to make their policy if they don't explain what it is, and that actually it's in no one's, it's not in their interest in terms of the smooth or speedy passage of their bill to do that. But as you say, that only really works if you have time to do the policy. So that's why our upstream involvement in trying to sort of protect that space and get early decisions from Number 10 and from the system is really important, because that policy making process takes time, but it's understanding what you're trying to achieve at the end of it and communicating that really clearly from the start that is the secret to it, I think.
And there's one of the things that's really interested me since I've been in government, from how I saw it from outside, that from outside it looks as if the government thought up legislation, presented it to Parliament, and it was essentially a fait accompli. Downing Street wanted it, Minister brought it forward, bingo, Queen gave royal assent. But it's not like that at all, really, is it? Because since I've been on the inside, I've seen the handling plans, and a lot of time and trouble is taken to get the views of backbench MPs and of peers, and to try to incorporate in the bill early to ensure the smooth passage through both houses. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit, because I think that's part of the hidden wiring, the dark matter of Parliament, that makes it much more democratically accountable than it's sometimes seen from the outside.
Yes, again, I think the interests of Parliament and government are, again, in that area much more aligned than sometimes it can appear. handling is a really big part of us looking at bids for bills in the first place, but it's also a big part of the sort of iterative process. It's in no one's interest to present a Queen's Speech full of legislation that is going to be absolutely ripped apart by Parliament and take absolutely ages to get through and emerge in a completely different shape. So actually ensuring that parliamentarians as far as possible are engaged in that policy making process, so that when consultations come out, for example, parliamentarians and select committees are properly briefed on it, have the opportunity to have their say. That might be formally through sort of pre-leg scrutiny, but actually far more commonly on almost all bills it will be a process of sort of meeting backbenchers, departmental meetings, all sorts of things, so that both sort of concerns can be taken on board in that process, but also so that the department have a really clear understanding of where concerns are going to emerge in Parliament, because again responses to that are always better if departments and others have time to think them through properly. Something that just emerges as an amendment is a surprise to everyone, and a response has to be developed in a day or two, is never going to be as thoughtful, it's never going to be as productive as something that actually backbenchers and departments have been able to have a discussion on, perhaps take views from sort of stakeholders and actually give a really considered, thoughtful approach to.
And even technically, the art of parliamentary draftsmanship is such that an amendment that is just cooked up on the backbenches is unlikely to make perfect law, and therefore if there's been early engagement and it's drafted by OPC, it's a much better chance it achieves its objective.
Yes, exactly, and there have been loads of instances of things which have first been sort of suggested on the backbenches, perhaps through private members' bills, that have then subsequently found their way into government bills. So it's much more of an iterative, sort of consultative process behind the scenes as well.
And you've had, in 3 years you've probably done 75 bills, plus some private bills which have had the sympathy, let's put it that way, of the government. So you can't be far off 100 bills. Do you have any particular favourites, bills that have proved difficult to start with and then have been a great success, or ones that you just feel are a model of good legislative practice?
That's a very hard question. I think the nature of bills has changed significantly over the time. I've been doing this job for 3 years, and obviously I joined with the context of sort of Brexit, no majority, and the way in which bills were conceived of, but also sort of the types of things that you have to think about when they go through Parliament are really different to the ones that you would think about now, and the bills themselves will look very different. We've also obviously had a lot of unexpected events happen, whether that's obviously sort of COVID is the big one, but various other things that have required expedited legislation. And again, that's not a model of legislation, but actually the way in which sort of departments and OPC have had to develop policy at real pace in response to real world life emergencies has been really interesting to watch, but also a really impressive bit of work, particularly from OPC, who have delivered miracles.
But doesn't it to some extent drive you mad that you've got this beautiful legislative programme all sorted out, and then suddenly you've got all this emergency legislation chucked in? That must be slightly frustrating.
Which is one of the great frustrations of this job. You feel like you've got a sort of a beautiful jigsaw that is very delicately balanced, and then somebody removes the part and the whole thing moves around. So yes, unfortunately, it is not the case that the Queen's Speech that you have developed at the start of the session is going to be what you would completely list in your prorogation speech at the end of a session. There's quite a few events happen, and there will be some things that nobody could have predicted. There will be a few things that perhaps arguably ought to have been predicted, and that's something that we try and work with Whitehall to make sure that we have a bit better sort of advanced knowledge of. So yes, and one of the real challenges is obviously if you have a well-developed parliamentary programme, you don't really have very much capacity in it because you're using parliamentary time to the max. So if you have additions, usually something has to give. So finding creative ways to try and minimise any impact or damage that additions to the programme might have is one of the day-to-day bits of this job.
So do you ever try and sneak in a boring bill so that you can finish it off later with an emergency bill because something will come, or would that be too Machiavellian?
There's lots of ways you can do it, and that's actually one of the reasons why it's quite important to have a mix of big and small bills, so that there is a bit of sort of flexibility in the programme. But yes, generally a good programme is one that is quite balanced between departments, between sort of size, and just to give you a little bit of flexibility and urgency as well in terms of when various things are needed, because royal assent deadlines, what real world things happen if legislation is not passed in time, is something that you have to take into account.
And we haven't even touched on secondary legislation, but you've actually been in charge with 2 periods of extraordinary volumes of secondary legislation. First of all, the Brexit period, when hundreds of SIs had to be brought forward in very short order, and then of course the COVID-related ones. I was watching as chairman of PBL as you were shepherding the Brexit SIs through. There was a lot of discipline that needed to be exerted on departments to make them meet their deadlines. As with legislation, how did you find that? How are your working relationships doing that? Because not all departments were always up to speed.
No, and secondary legislation was something that it's quite new to have central or indeed any oversight of within government. So that was something that was prompted by the huge number of exit SIs, as you say, but is a system that we found works quite well. So we are keeping it, even though the number of exit SIs is now relatively small. But it's been a real sort of culture change for departments actually, and the need to plan secondary legislation in a way that they've only really had to do for primary legislation before has been a real challenge. And I say this as somebody who was previous to this job, was in a department having to do that job, and it is really, really hard. But I have to say departments have really sort of risen to the challenge, and it has not been a quick or easy process. But actually I think they have found the benefits themselves in being able to identify what it is they need to do, have some sort of central oversight of that, some sort of planning in terms of sort of sequencing, but also handling, because of course secondary legislation needs as much handling as primary often. But yes, it has been quite a challenge, but I think there are 2 really good things that have come out of it. First of all, the sort of discipline in terms of timing, that's really helpful to government in terms of scheduling, but also the quality, and having that central oversight in those processes have enabled us to feed back some of the concerns of parliamentary committees, particularly the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee and the Lords, and really try and improve the quality of both SIs, but also explanatory memoranda, because that's something that sort of typically departments themselves are responsible for, rather than sort of OPC who draft primary legislation.
Yes, I remember this time a year ago we had a list week by week from September all the way through to Christmas of how many SIs had to be introduced and when, and a list also of the ones that had slipped. And it was an amazing effort of your office to keep the slippage down and the productivity up, so that I think in the end we got all of them done. I mean, there may have been 1 or 2 that slipped into January, but nothing that really mattered.
Yeah. Again, it's one of those big jigsaw pieces really, in that again, one department might not have too many SIs, but actually cumulatively, if they're 20 come a month late, that might push up the volume that goes into Parliament significantly and then become undeliverable. And
there are only a certain number of committee hours when they can be considered, and that all has to be slotted in. And then of course the COVID SIs, which when we thought we'd finished, we thought we were in sight of the finishing line, then COVID hit with a whole new stream of SIs.
Yes, exactly. I mean, we were, I think, looking forward to taking a deep breath and kind of having a little bit of a quieter time on the secondary side, but sadly it was not to be. But again, that I think that showed the value of the system, so that we could work out what was coming through, and we've worked really closely with other parts of government, particularly the COVID task force in the Cabinet Office, to have sight of the changes that might be needed. Often under multiple different scenarios, changing day by day, but particularly things like tiering when there were new SIs coming in every week, having that system and that team who could really work with them and really help on sort of project planning what would be needed by when, and then liaise with your offices and the other business managers' offices on actually at what point something needs to be into Parliament to get approval in time for. whenever the changes need to come into effect. So yes, I think it's demonstrated the value of the system.
So to go back to something we were discussing earlier, the Queen's speech, the carriage draws up, the state trumpeters sound their notes, the Queen processes through the Royal Gallery into the Prince's chamber, the Lord High Chancellor hands her speech. You're sitting watching it ideally from the gallery, but possibly because of COVID last time from home.
It's one of the best parts of this job. I mean, it's, you can't often get to say that in most jobs, and yeah, it's amazing. It's both a very strange and a very special time, and Queen's Speech Day in the PBL team is a sort of day of celebration, so we usually watch the speech all together and then sort of have a team celebration in the afternoon, because that period running up to it is a very intense one for them.
And it's the culmination of the previous year's work building up to it.
And there's a huge amount of supporting material that before I did this job I didn't really realise. So there's a briefing pack on the Queen's speech that goes on gov.uk that is several hundred pages long, that explains what each bill does, what the impact is, some sort of top lines on each of it, just to unpack the Queen's words a little bit and explain what it means for people day to day, and putting all that together with contributions from every Whitehall department is a bit of a mega job.
Well, I just want to end now by thanking you, because I've been chairing PBL for the last 2 years. You were already firmly established by then. The way you organise it and run it, your ability to give me summaries of what people have said during the course of the meeting so that I have something sensible to say at the end is formidable. All handed to me in an elegant script so I can look as if I know what I'm talking about. I'm enormously grateful for all you've done to help not only this government, but as an independent, impartial civil servant, a willingness to help any government. And I think you are an absolute model of civil service commitment to the good governance of this country. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure and actually honoured to do the job, and yes, working with you, the other business managers and the fantastic PBL team. I shall be very sad to leave.
We will be very sad to miss you. Thank you.